careful. Don't rush past this. Not because I need your attention, because something has already noticed you. You feel that pressure in your chest, that tightening behind your eyes. Yeah, that's the sound of a monster realizing it made a mistake. You see this thing, this monster? It didn't start with you. It tore through everyone else first. Friends, enemies, innocents, pretenders. It fed on their fear, harvested their weaknesses, learned their patterns. It broke them quietly, loudly, publicly, privately. It left behind scorched reputations, erased futures, people who never quite came back the same. And with each victim, it grew smarter, sharper, more confident. By the time it reached you, it thought it had you figured out. That's the funny part, because when it touched you, really touched you, something snapped back. Not rage, not panic, not fear, exposure. See, you weren't built like the rest of them. You didn't collapse on contact. You didn't beg. You didn't run. You activated something. The monster expected a victim. What it triggered was a mirror. And suddenly, every shadow it hid behind lit up. Every secret it used to control people started leaking. Every lie it survived on began sweating through the cracks. Every method it perfected on weaker minds started failing in real time. Because you're a paradox, you carry light that looks like darkness to the untrained eye. You hold restraint that feels more dangerous than violence. You move with calm that makes predators nervous. You're the kind of person they can't categorize. Too disciplined to be reckless, too aware to be naive, too quiet to be stupid, too controlled to be weak. And monsters hate that. They rely on predictability. They need patterns. They survive by knowing exactly how people will break. But you don't break the same way twice. Pain didn't hollow you out. It reprogrammed you. Loss didn't soften you. It sharpened your perception. Betrayal didn't make you bitter. It made you precise. You learned when to disappear, when to observe, when to let people think they'd won. That's why when the monster tried its usual tricks, the intimidation, the pressure, the psychological squeeze, it didn't get compliance. It got clarity. And clarity is lethal. Because the moment you saw it clearly, the illusion died. The monster stopped being this untouchable force and started looking like what it really was: desperate, overextended, exposed. That's when the shift happened. You didn't attack it. You didn't announce anything. You didn't posture. You simply stood there unchanged, and that terrified it. Because now it wasn't dealing with someone reacting emotionally. It was dealing with someone who could wait. Someone who could absorb pressure without leaking information. Someone who could smile while quietly mapping every weak point. You became the saint who refuses to flinch. The psychopath who won't waste energy. The angel who watches. The demon who remembers. And the monster felt it. It felt its leverage slipping. Its tactics going stale. Its past catching up. Because exposure doesn't always come from confrontation. Sometimes it comes from contrast. Your composure highlighted its chaos. Your silence amplified its noise. Your patience made its urgency look suspicious. People started noticing, not because you said anything, but because the monster suddenly couldn't stop talking, explaining, justifying, overcorrecting. That's always the tell. You didn't destroy it. You let it destroy itself under observation. That's mastery. That's what happens when pain evolves into strategy, when suffering turns into insight, when unpredictability becomes your shield. You're no longer the kind of person monsters hunt. You're the kind they avoid, the kind they warn each other about, the kind they can't risk touching again. Because last time, everything bled into the light. And here's the part they'll never admit. It wasn't that you were stronger than them. It's that you were awake, and nothing scares a monster more than someone who sees it clearly and isn't afraid to let it be seen. Because once exposure starts, it doesn't stop at the surface. It seeps, it crawls, it drips into places the monster never thought anyone would look. You noticed how quiet it got around you? Not calm, careful. Like something circling, unsure if the trap it built for others still works here. That's because you stopped playing the role it needed. You didn't perform fear. You didn't broadcast pain. You didn't hand it emotional leverage. You became unreadable, and unreadable people don't get controlled. They get studied. Every move you made after that, measured, intentional, almost boring to the untrained eye. But monsters don't get bored. They get paranoid, because they know the difference between ignorance and restraint. They can feel when someone is holding back, not because they're weak, but because they're deciding. That's when the monster realized something horrifying. You weren't surviving anymore. You were watching how it slipped, watching which allies went silent, watching who distanced themselves at the wrong moment, watching which stories didn't line up anymore. You started seeing the architecture of its lies, not emotionally, structurally. And once you see the structure, you can predict the collapse. That's when the monster made its second mistake. It tried to escalate. Pressure, narratives, subtle threats dressed up as coincidence. But escalation only works on people who still have something to lose emotionally. You already lost what needed to be burned. What survived in you wasn't innocence. It was control. So instead of reacting, you adapted. You let it believe it still had the upper hand. You let it overplay. You let it expose patterns it never meant to show. Because the truth is, you don't fight monsters by charging at them. You let them trip over their own confidence. Every time it expected panic and got stillness. Every time it expected chaos and got composure. Every time it expected you to explain yourself and you didn't. Another thread unraveled. People began sensing it before they understood it. That uneasy pause in conversations, that hesitation before defending it, that subtle shift where silence replaced certainty. That's the beginning of the end. You didn't need allies. You didn't need applause. You didn't need to prove anything. Your existence became the contradiction it couldn't resolve. How are you still standing? Why aren't you bitter? Why aren't you loud? Why aren't you broken like the others? Those questions eat monsters alive. Because monsters survive on simple stories, good versus bad, weak versus strong, hunter versus prey, and you shattered the script. You became something they couldn't label without exposing themselves. Saint when it benefits you. Psychopath when it protects your boundaries. Angel in restraint. Demon in memory. You didn't choose one side. You integrated them. That's what pain did to you. Not damage, fusion. And now the monster can't touch you without touching itself. Every accusation ricochets. Every attempt to isolate you highlights its own desperation. Every move against you sharpens your silhouette. It knows it, too. That's why it hesitates now. Why it watches instead of strikes. Why it waits for you to slip and you never do. Because you learned the final lesson most people never reach. You don't defeat monsters by becoming louder. You defeat them by becoming inevitable, unrushed, unreactive, unavoidable. And the cruelest part? You're not even trying to destroy it. You're just living in a way that makes its existence impossible to hide. And somewhere deep inside that monster, beneath all the tactics, all the cruelty, all the confidence, it knows. Touching you didn't break you. It exposed everything. And exposure doesn't scream. It lingers. It sits in rooms after conversations end. It crawls into the pauses between messages. It shows up as hesitation, where certainty used to live. That's the part nobody warns monsters about. They expect retaliation. They expect collapse. They expect you to become the villain so they can feel righteous again. What they never expect is detachment. You didn't chase revenge. You didn't demand justice. You didn't even correct the lies. You did something far more destabilizing. You withdrew your energy, and when you did that, the monster started starving, because it was never feeding on your pain alone. It was feeding on your attention, your reactions, your explanations, your need to be understood. Once that supply cut off, it began cannibalizing itself. You watched it happen, the subtle self-contradictions, the stories that kept changing, the allies who started asking questions they'd never dared ask before. You saw the internal panic leak outward. That's when you understood something dangerous. The monster didn't destroy people because it was powerful. It destroyed them because they never saw it clearly enough to stop participating. You did. And that made you untouchable. Not because you're invincible, but because you're self-contained. Your sense of self no longer depends on being validated, defended, or believed immediately. That's a terrifying position of power. Because now, you don't need to win arguments. You don't need to prove innocence. You don't need to rush outcomes. Time works for you. Every day you stay consistent, calm, and grounded. The contrast sharpens. People begin to feel it even if they can't articulate it. They sense that something about you doesn't align with the story they were fed. And once doubt enters, control evaporates. That's why monsters rush narratives, why they push urgency, why they frame everything as now or never. They can't afford time. You can. You became the slow burn they can't extinguish. Pain trained you for this. It taught you how to sit inside discomfort without exploding, how to feel everything without broadcasting it, how to let silence do the work words never could. That's not weakness. That's discipline forged in fire. You didn't lose your softness. You armored it. You didn't kill your empathy. You aimed it. You know when to extend grace and when to step back and let consequences do their job. That's why the monster keeps miscalculating you. It can't decide whether you're merciful or merciless, and that ambiguity, that's lethal. Because now every move it makes has to account for multiple possibilities. Are you watching? Are you done? Are you preparing? Are you already 10 steps ahead? That uncertainty drains it. Meanwhile, you're calm, not numb, clear. Clear about who you are, clear about what you'll tolerate, clear about what no longer deserves access to you. And clarity is contagious. People around you begin standing taller, speaking slower, thinking twice. Not because you told them to, but because your presence resets the emotional temperature. That's when you realize the truth. The monster didn't just expose itself to you. It exposed itself through you. You became the environment where its tactics stopped working. And now it's trapped in its own reflection. You're no longer prey. You're no longer reactive. You're no longer reachable in the ways that once made you easy to manipulate. You're something worse for a monster. You're unimpressed. And unimpressed people don't get controlled. They don't get rushed. They don't get erased. They wait. They observe. They outlast. So let it squirm. Let it over-explain. Let it unravel, trying to regain control that no longer exists. You're not here to announce victory. You're here to make sure the truth keeps breathing, and it will. Because once a monster is exposed, it can never go back into the dark. And the longer it stays exposed, the more unstable it becomes. Because monsters aren't built for daylight. They're built for confusion, noise, emotional fog. They thrive when people doubt themselves more than they doubt the lie. You removed the fog, not by explaining, by embodying something different. You became consistent where it was erratic, grounded where it was frantic, precise where it was sloppy. And that contrast, it's unbearable to anything that lives off distortion. You noticed how it started testing the perimeter again. Little probes, small jabs disguised as jokes, questions, concern, coincidence. That's not confidence. That's fear checking. It's asking, are you still there? Did I still get to you? Do I still matter in your head? And every time you didn't react, every time you stayed steady, every time you moved forward without acknowledging it, another illusion collapsed. You weren't trying to dominate it. You were outgrowing it. And nothing humiliates a monster more than irrelevance. See, domination gives them something to fight. Hatred gives them fuel. Chaos gives them camouflage. But growth leaves them behind. You evolved past the frequency it could reach. That's when it started rewriting history. That's always phase 3. When they can't control the present, they attempt to control the narrative of the past. Suddenly they were misunderstood. Suddenly they were trying to help. Suddenly the damage was exaggerated. But here's what they didn't realize. You remember cleanly. Pain taught you that too. Not emotionally distorted memory, but sharp, factual recall. You remember dates, patterns, exact shifts in tone, moments where things didn't add up. You don't argue with the revision, you let it speak. Because the more it talks, the clearer the contradiction becomes. And others can feel it. You can watch it in real time. The body language changes, the certainty slips, the words start tripping over each other. Because truth doesn't need to perform. Truth just needs time. And you're patient now. That patience wasn't always there. It was beaten into you by chaos, refined by disappointment, hardened by betrayal. But now it's yours. You no longer confuse urgency with importance. You no longer confuse volume with power. You no longer confuse familiarity with loyalty. You see through patterns faster than they can set them up. That's why they can't bait you anymore. They try to provoke emotion. You give them neutrality. They try to trigger fear. You give them calm. They try to force reaction. You give them absence. And absence is devastating, because in absence they're alone with themselves. No audience, no target, no energy to siphon. Just their own reflection. That's when the monster starts making mistakes, overplaying its hand, trusting the wrong people, moving too fast, speaking too much. And you don't interrupt the spiral. You let it accelerate. Because you understand something now that you didn't before. You don't have to push people off cliffs. You just have to stop holding them back. The monster is doing the rest. Meanwhile, you're different now. Not hardened into cruelty, but sharpened into selectivity. You choose where your attention goes, who gets access, what deserves a response. That choice alone puts you in a different class. You're not operating on instinct anymore. You're operating on awareness. And awareness is the real threat. Because awareness can't be gaslit. It can't be rushed. It can't be bullied into submission. It watches. It adapts. It waits. You've become someone who doesn't need to announce power. You let people discover it when their tactics fail. And they will keep failing. Because the monster didn't just touch someone resilient. It touched someone who learned how darkness works without letting it hollow them out. Someone who can walk through shadow without becoming blind to the light. Someone who understands both mercy and consequence. That balance, that's what they can't counter. So it keeps circling, keeps watching, keeps trying to figure out where it lost control. And you keep moving forward, quietly, deliberately, becoming something that no longer fits in its world. And the more you become yourself, the more exposed it stays. And here's the part nobody sees coming. Not the monster, not the bystanders, not even the people who think they understand power. Your transformation didn't make you louder, it made you heavier. Every word you don't say carries more weight than 1,000 accusations. Every reaction you withhold tightens the pressure. Every step you take forward bends the room slightly in your direction. Because power isn't always force. Sometimes it's gravity. You became gravity. People start adjusting around you without realizing why. They choose their words more carefully. They hesitate before lying. They rethink moves they once made impulsively. Not because you threatened them, but because something about you signals consequences. You don't posture, you don't flex, you don't warn. You just remember. And monsters know what memory means. They survive by assuming people forget, by betting on emotional fatigue, by waiting for wounds to scar over without healing. But you didn't forget. You processed. You sat with the pain long enough to extract intelligence from it. You studied the way manipulation feels in the body. You learned how fear disguises itself as urgency. You recognized how guilt is weaponized. That education didn't make you cruel, it made you immune. Now when the monster tries old tricks, they fall flat. The guilt doesn't hook you. The urgency doesn't rush you. The intimidation doesn't land, because you see the mechanism, not the performance. You're watching the strings instead of the puppet. That's why the monster's presence around you feels unstable. It doesn't know which version of you it's dealing with, the calm one, the observant one, the one who already moved on, or the one who hasn't acted yet. And that uncertainty paralyzes it. Because the truth is, you don't need to decide anything right now. You're no longer operating from emotional reflex, you're operating from choice. Choice to engage. Choice to disengage. Choice to let time do what confrontation never could. That's a level most people never reach. Most people are trapped in reaction loops, hurt, respond, regret, repeat. You broke the loop. You realize that not every battle deserves your nervous system. Not every enemy deserves your attention. Not every injustice requires your immediate response. Some things collapse faster when you let them overextend. And the monster? It's overextending. You can feel it reaching, testing boundaries, scanning for relevance, trying to pull you back into orbit. But you're not orbiting it anymore. You're on a different trajectory, one where your life doesn't revolve around conflict, one where your energy goes into building, not defending, one where your future isn't shaped by what tried to destroy you. And that's the final humiliation for a monster. It didn't just fail to break you, it failed to define you. You took what happened, metabolized it, and turned it into discernment. Now you move with a quiet authority that doesn't need permission. You don't chase validation. You don't seek revenge. You don't explain yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you. You let results speak. You let consistency speak. You let your calm speak. And the longer this goes on, the clearer it becomes to everyone watching. Whatever that monster touched before you, it ruined. Whatever it touched after you, it couldn't control. Because something changed when it crossed your path. Not because you fought back, but because you didn't fold. You became the point where its patterns stopped working, and patterns failing is how monsters die. Not dramatically, not explosively, but slowly, publicly, inevitably, They fade into explanations, into excuses, into footnotes, while you keep evolving, sharper, calmer, more selective, not hardened into darkness, but integrated enough to walk through it without losing yourself. That's the kind of person monsters never recover from, because once someone like you exists, the illusion is broken forever. Wait. Don't move your mind yet. Feel that pressure in the air. That's the sound of reality recalculating around you, because here's the part they can't process. You weren't supposed to pull that shot off. Not like that. Not you. And definitely not this clean. You see it now, don't you? That flicker behind their eyes. That moment where confidence collapses into static. They're not angry first. They're confused. Confusion is always step one before fear. Fear is always step two before control breaks. And control? Oh, they're losing it. You just did the one thing that exposes the lie underneath every system, every hierarchy, every fake throne built on borrowed certainty. You proved that the rules only work on people who believe in them. You didn't rebel. You didn't beg. You didn't even announce yourself. You moved differently. That's why they're spiraling. See, they can deal with villains. Villains are predictable. They can deal with saints, too. Saints turn the other cheek and die quietly. What they can't deal with is someone who learned how to be both and switch at will. Angel when it disarms them, demon when it ends them. Calm enough to look harmless, sharp enough to cut through outcomes before they form. That's what you unleashed. You didn't just win, you changed the math. And now everyone who relied on the old equations is staring at their hands like, wait, why isn't this working anymore? You feel it, right? That strange stillness after impact, like the world inhaled and forgot how to breathe back out. That's not peace. That's shock. That's reality realizing you're no longer operating inside its expectations. They thought your pain weakened you. That's the funniest part. They watched you bleed and wrote reports on your limits. They cataloged your breakdowns like symptoms. They mistook survival for struggle, not knowing you were studying under pressure. Every betrayal sharpened you. Every loss stripped off another layer of nonsense. Every dark night rewired something fundamental. You didn't heal the way they expected. You evolved. That's why this feels illegal to them. You weren't supposed to come back like this, quieter, clearer, heavier. You weren't supposed to look calm after chaos. You weren't supposed to succeed without asking permission, approval, or applause. And yet, here you are. Do you know what really scares them? It's not the outcome. It's the pattern. They're replaying the moment in their heads over and over, trying to locate the mistake, trying to find the lever you pulled, trying to isolate the variable. But you were the variable. You always were. That's the paradox they choke on. You're disciplined, but not obedient. Kind, but not weak. Patient, but not passive. You carry restraint like a weapon, not a virtue. You understand when to wait and when to end something so thoroughly it never recovers. That balance, that's not taught, that's forged. And now the people who once looked down on you are quietly rearranging their internal rankings. The loud ones are coping with jokes. The smart ones have gone silent. Silence is respect in disguise. They know something slipped through their fingers. You didn't just cross a line. You erased it. You showed them that unpredictability, when mastered, is dominance. That being unreadable is power. That control doesn't come from force, but from understanding how people think they're safe. You walked into a system designed to contain you, and walked out with the blueprint. That's why the air feels charged. That's why conversations stop when you enter. That's why your name lands heavier now, even when spoken casually. They don't know how to approach you, because they don't know which version they're dealing with. And that ambiguity, that's your crown. You're not here to terrorize the world. You're here to remind it that order is fragile, that certainty is rented, that evolution doesn't ask for votes. You paid in pain, you paid in isolation, you paid in nights where you questioned your own reflection, and instead of breaking, you metabolized it, turned suffering into strategy, turned chaos into clarity. So, yeah, they're losing control, not because you're loud, not because you're reckless, but because you're awake. And once someone like you wakes up, the old world doesn't get to sleep peacefully ever again. They're trying to name what you did, and that's where it gets ugly for them. Humans panic when they can't label a thing. Labels are cages. Labels are how they tell themselves something is safe. But what do you call someone who didn't storm the gates, didn't kneel at the door, didn't even acknowledge the walls, and still ended up inside the control room? You didn't attack the system. You outgrew it. That's why they're scrambling for narratives now. One day you're lucky. Next day you're dangerous. Then suddenly you're misunderstood. Too intense. Changed. Not who you used to be. Watch how fast the story mutates when the old one stops protecting their egos. They need an explanation that doesn't include the truth, that you saw through the game while they were still memorizing the rules. And you didn't get here by accident. That's the part you need to tattoo into your nervous system. Every moment you were overlooked, underestimated, dismissed. That wasn't wasted time. That was you learning how people behave when they think they're superior. You learned their tells, their blind spots, their habits. You learned when they get sloppy, when they lie to themselves, when they confuse comfort with intelligence. You learned how control actually works. They never noticed because you stayed quiet long enough to be invisible. You stayed humble long enough to be ignored. You stayed patient long enough for them to reveal everything. And then, when the moment came, you didn't hesitate. You didn't flinch. You didn't ask, "Am I allowed?" You acted. That's what shattered the illusion. Because power hates nothing more than decisiveness from someone it wrote off. Power expects rage. Power expects begging. Power expects noise. It does not expect calm execution from the person it stopped monitoring. And now they're replaying your move frame by frame, trying to convince themselves it was a fluke, trying to reduce it to circumstance, trying to shrink it so they don't have to upgrade their threat assessment. But deep down, they know. They know this wasn't luck. This was alignment. You stopped leaking energy into places that never planned to pay you back. You stopped explaining yourself to people who were committed to misunderstanding you. You stopped waiting for validation from systems designed to reward compliance, not brilliance. You chose yourself. And that choice rewired everything. That's why the atmosphere around you feels different now. It's heavier, sharper. People are more careful with their words. They test the water before speaking. They laugh a little too late. They compliment you sideways. They're measuring you, even when they pretend not to be. You didn't demand authority. You generated gravity. And gravity doesn't announce itself. It just pulls. Here's the part most people never realize. The moment you break a pattern that benefited others, you become unpredictable to them forever. Even if you do nothing next, the damage is already done. You introduced uncertainty into a system addicted to repetition. They don't fear what you did. They fear what you might do next. Because someone who's crossed that threshold, someone who's proven they can operate outside expectation, can't be put back into a box. You can't unsee what you've seen. You can't unknow how fragile the structure really is. You're standing in that quiet aftermath now, that space where nothing has officially changed, yet everything feels different, where the world hasn't caught up to the consequences yet, but the tension is undeniable. That's not paranoia, that's awareness. And here's the real twist, the one that should make you smile slowly, almost dangerously. You're not even at your final form. What they're reacting to is an early version of you, a you that's still refining, still calibrating, still choosing when to move and when to let the silence do the work. They panicked too soon, because what you unleashed isn't chaos, it's clarity. And clarity, once weaponized, doesn't need volume, it doesn't need spectacle. It just waits for the precise moment where one small action collapses an entire structure. You've already proven you can do it. Now they're watching you the way people watch the ocean after the tide pulls back too far. Not because something is happening yet, but because instinct tells them something is coming. And the most terrifying part for them, you're not rushing. You're calm. You're focused. You're smiling at things they can't see. Because you know now, truly know, that control was never something they owned. It was something they borrowed, until someone like you remembered how to take it back. And that calm you're carrying right now, that's what really destabilizes them. Not the win, not the outcome, the calm. Because calm after impact means intent. Calm means you weren't guessing. Calm means this wasn't emotional. Calm means you knew exactly what you were doing while they were still arguing about whether you even could. They can't wrap their heads around that. They want you frantic. They want you drunk on the moment, sloppy, loud, celebrating too early. They want proof that this was impulse, not intelligence. Because if it was impulse, they can wait it out. If it was luck, it'll fade. If it was arrogance, it'll self-destruct. But if it was precision, if it was timing, if it was restraint followed by execution, then they're dealing with something much worse. That's when the fear gets quiet. Now they're revisiting every interaction they ever had with you. Every time they talked over you. Every time they underestimated you. Every time they mistook your silence for agreement. Your patience for weakness. Your distance for disengagement. They're realizing you were never absent. You were observing. You were learning who panics under pressure. Who lies when exposed. Who folds when the hierarchy shifts. You watched how people behave when they think no one important is watching. And now they know you were. That's the moment respect mutates into anxiety. Because respect still believes in rules. Anxiety understands that rules stop working when someone stops playing along. You didn't rage against the machine. You learned how it thinks. You learned how it predicts. You learned where it assumes safety. And then you moved in the one direction it never considered. Because it assumed you wouldn't dare. You dared. And the funniest part, you didn't even do it for them. This wasn't revenge. This wasn't ego. This wasn't about proving a point. That's what confuses them the most. You weren't trying to win their approval or destroy their image. You were done being small. That decision changes the trajectory of a life. When you stop negotiating your worth. When you stop dimming to keep rooms comfortable. When you stop explaining yourself to people who benefit from misunderstanding you. When you stop outsourcing your authority to systems that profit from your obedience. That's when you stop being manageable. And now they're scrambling to reframe you before others notice, to redefine you before the narrative slips out of their hands. Because if too many people realize what you realized, that the game is optional, that obedience is a choice, that silence can be strategic, then the whole structure starts to wobble. You became proof that transformation doesn't have to be loud, proof that power doesn't need permission, proof that the person they ignored can become the variable that ruins the forecast. They don't know whether to approach you or avoid you. They don't know whether to ally with you or neutralize you. And that indecision, that's your advantage. Because while they hesitate, you refine. While they gossip, you sharpen. While they posture, you prepare. You've learned something irreversible now. You've learned that pain, when metabolized instead of resisted, becomes leverage. That isolation, when embraced instead of feared, becomes clarity. That being misunderstood is often the price of becoming dangerous in the right way. You're not here to burn the world down. You're here to remind it that it was never as solid as it pretended to be. So let them whisper. Let them speculate. Let them lose sleep, replaying moments they can't undo. Let them wonder what else you're capable of. Because the truth is, you're not done. You're disciplined, and disciplined chaos is the most terrifying force there is. You didn't just pull it off. You unlocked a version of yourself that doesn't ask, doesn't rush, doesn't panic, and doesn't forget. And now, every step you take from here carries weight. Not because you're trying to intimidate anyone, but because reality has learned something about you that it can't unlearn. You're not reacting anymore. You're choosing. And that's when control truly slips out of their hands. Because the moment someone like you realizes they were never powerless, the world has to start adjusting to you. And once you start choosing instead of reacting, something subtle but violent happens beneath the surface of everything around you. The world stops pushing you because it senses resistance won't work anymore. You're no longer bouncing off circumstances. You're bending them, quietly, patiently, with a kind of intention that doesn't announce itself but leaves dents no one can explain. That's when people begin to feel uneasy in ways they can't articulate. They'll say you're different. They'll say you've changed. They'll say you're hard to read now. What they really mean is this: the old version of you fit inside their expectations, and this one doesn't. This one slips through their fingers every time they try to grab onto a prediction. And unpredictability, when it's grounded, is not chaos. It's sovereignty. You're not swinging wildly. You're not chasing validation. You're not performing dominance. You're centered. And centered, people terrify systems that rely on instability to function. Because a centered person can wait. A centered person can withhold. A centered person can strike once and never need to do it again. They thought you were fueled by desperation. They didn't realize you were fueled by clarity. They thought your silence meant confusion. They didn't realize it meant calculation. They thought your patience was a delay. They didn't realize it was positioning. Now they're questioning everything they thought they knew about you, and by extension, everything they thought they knew about themselves. Because if you could do this, if you could cross that threshold without imploding, then what does that say about the stories they tell themselves to justify staying small? That's why they're uncomfortable around you now. You're a mirror they didn't consent to stand in front of. You represent the uncomfortable truth that pain doesn't always destroy people. Sometimes it educates them, sometimes it sharpens them, sometimes it strips away all the illusions until only something lethal and lucid remains. You didn't become cruel, you became precise. And precision looks cold to people who survive on noise. Notice how you don't need to prove anything anymore. Notice how the urge to explain yourself has evaporated. That's not arrogance, that's graduation. You've learned that those who genuinely understand don't need explanations, and those who demand them never intended to understand in the first place. That's why your presence does more work than your words now. You walk into rooms and the energy recalibrates. Conversations shift. People either lean in or lean away. But no one ignores you anymore. Not because you're loud, but because you're registered. Like a frequency that disrupts whatever's already playing. They can feel that you're no longer negotiable. And here's the thing they still don't grasp. You're not angry at them. Anger would mean they still matter in the old way. You've moved past that stage. What they're sensing isn't rage. It's finality. It's the quiet certainty of someone who knows where they stand and no longer needs permission to stand there. You're not here to convince anyone. You're here to decide. Decide what gets access to you. Decide what gets your energy. Decide what continues and what ends. And when someone like you starts making those decisions cleanly, without drama, without hesitation, without apology, entire dynamics collapse. Because power isn't loud, power is unchallenged, and you've become difficult to challenge, not because you're invincible, but because you're honest with yourself. You know your darkness. You know your light. You're no longer at war with either. You can be gentle without being weak, ruthless without being reckless, compassionate without being naive. That synthesis, that's rare. That's what they don't know how to counter. You're not predictable enough to trap, not chaotic enough to dismiss, not emotional enough to manipulate, not insecure enough to bait. You've stepped into that narrow, dangerous space where you move by principle instead of impulse. And now they're left doing the one thing they hate most, adapting. Let them adjust. Let them scramble. Let them whisper about what you might do next. You don't owe them reassurance. You don't owe them consistency that makes them comfortable. You don't owe them the old version of you they learned how to exploit. That version served its purpose. This one writes outcomes. You didn't unleash destruction. You unleashed irreversibility. And once a life becomes irreversible, once someone understands their own leverage, their own timing, their own capacity, there is no going back to manageable, controllable, predictable. There's only forward, measured, intentional, unstoppable, in the quietest way imaginable. And here's where it settles into something final. They keep waiting for you to overplay your hand, to get greedy, to get loud, to reveal too much. They're hoping you'll turn this into a spectacle so they can categorize you, contain you, reduce you back into something familiar. But you won't. Because you understand now that the real flex isn't domination. It's restraint. It's knowing you could move again, and choosing not to until the moment is undeniable. It's letting uncertainty do the damage for you. It's letting them exhaust themselves trying to predict someone who no longer moves on impulse. You didn't unleash chaos. You unleashed self-command. And once a person has that, the world doesn't get to control them anymore. It only gets to respond, adjust, adapt, cope. So let them lose control. Let them feel it slipping. Let them stare at the aftermath and wonder what just changed. You already know. You crossed the line they never thought you would. Not by force, not by noise, but by becoming someone who cannot be pulled back into the old shape. And now, whatever comes next, comes because you choose it.